I'm so excited. I have a special treat for you today. My guest and my old friend, Dr. Kelly Casperson. She's a urologist. She's a popular podcast host of the incredible You Are Not Broken podcast. And now she's a best-selling author, mother of two, married 13 years. Welcome, Dr. Kelly Casperson. How are you?
I'm so good. Thanks for having me.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. Now, you have accomplished a ton since we have talked last. It was like hard to nail this down because I know you are like super busy fixing all the world's sex problems. Like, tell me about what's new.
Oh man, well the book came out end of June of this year. You Are Not Broken. Stop shitting all over your sex life. And the podcast is humming along. We're 2.5 years into it now, and it's still awesome and international, and that's really fun.
Amazing, amazing. So every superhero has an origin story, and I absolutely love yours. I've heard it a few times, but I just love it every single time. So could you start by telling us how you went from a urologist, mostly dealing with like men's pelvic areas, to a total expert of female genitals and amazing sex?
Yeah, totally. So I'm a general urologist, right? So that's 6 years of surgical training after medical school for people who want to do the math of what this takes. And then, so I was about 7 years out of residency then. And it was, you get to the 7 year itch. The 7 year itch is real, right? Whether it's your marriage or your career or whatever. And you get kind of like, you get kind of good at it. And, you get kind of like, oh my gosh, is this what I'm going to do? It becomes like less intellectually challenging after a point. You just get good at it, right? And so, like, the time was ripe for lightning to strike my brain. And I had a patient of mine who I was very close with, great relationship with her, and was seeing her for other urology issues. And she came to my office and was crying about her sexless marriage. And like, the lightning struck. And it was like, is it true that women are complicated and we don't actually know anything about them and they're just small men? And we give out Viagra like, M&Ms if you're a urologist, right? And it was like, wait, who's taking care of the people who are sleeping with the people we're giving Viagra to?
Right.
And I assumed it was the OB-GYNs, right? Or the primary care docs. And then so I dove deep, read all the books, started going to the conferences, and was like, oh no, the gyns don't have any training either. And it actually makes tons of sense for a urologist to take this on because we do surgery down there. We're very comfortable with anatomy down there. And we're also very comfortable in the penis and the scrotum, which are the exact same structures. They're just rearranged differently in the clitoris and the labia. So it's actually like a very normal evolution, but is again something that we don't get taught because I think we think other people are taking care of it. So that was the beginning. It was basically a life changing patient. She changed my life.
I love it. I love it. And I love what you do now because I feel like you add so much just humor and real into like such a difficult topic. But
Yeah.
I interviewed you a few times last year when you were just getting started kind of with all of this. Maybe it's been a few years now, but you were studying like crazy because you couldn't believe how much they didn't teach you in medical school. So how do you feel about it now? And what are you doing to right this wrong? Like, why are doctors coming out of medical school and not knowing anything about sexual functioning?
Yeah, I mean, my thought on it, I don't know if this is the real answer, but my thought on it is medical school is very patriarchal, right? It's like we learn what the people learn from the people that taught them, it's very passed down. And it's like we don't really research women. And if you just look at women's health in general, whether it's heart disease or, anything like that, like the research dollars aren't there compared to what we're researching in men. So number one is that we just don't have the dollars behind it. And then number two, it's like, if your mentor didn't know anything to teach you, you're not. And let alone the fact that sex in our culture and in the world is filled with like shame and it's quiet and it happens behind closed doors and it's almost like not polite company, right? And so I think all those things add up to being like, yeah, well, nobody knows what they're doing, but like they don't need any help.
So you started educating people once you like realized like, oh my gosh, this is a huge hole that needs to be filled. And so you started a podcast, You're Not Broken, which is awesome. And now you have this best-selling book by the same name. Can you talk about like how all of that happened and how that just became?
Yeah, well, I mean, the name came because the more I learned, and then women would come into my office and they'd be like, "I don't have an orgasm when I put the penis in the vagina," and I'm like, "Well, that's normal. That's 70% of women. You're not broken." And another woman who's, she's like, "I have a different sexual desire than my partner." I'm like, "Well, that's normal. You're not broken." So I just like it's just a little bit of education goes a long way into realizing like you're just living a very normal experience, but you're choosing to beat yourself up about it because you don't have the education, right? So I'm
Totally.
like, aha, that's the podcast name. That's got to be the book's name. And it's just who you surround yourself with. I've started surrounding myself with physicians who podcast, who write books. Like when that becomes your peer group, then they're like, Kelly, where's your book? And I'm like, oh yeah, right. Okay, well, how about this year? I'll write the book. So it just, you surround yourself with the people who are doing the things, and then you become somebody who does the things.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you did the thing because I love the way you write with such honesty and humor about a topic that most people cannot or will not talk about. So your candor is refreshing, and I feel like I got to know you so much better just like through reading this book. Like I'm like, oh yeah, Kelly would totally say that way.
Yeah,
Um,
that's what most people say, and especially it's interesting because like my friends who read it, they're like, "Oh my gosh, this is totally you," and then strangers will read it and they'll be like, "Oh, I feel like I totally know you." So
right.
it's
Like I
coming
feel like we've gone out
appropriate.
on a few coffee
Yeah,
dates and like we just hang out all the time.
yeah, it's coming across appropriately for all the people.
But what do you hope people will come away with from reading this? Or what besides the title, You Are Not Broken, do you hope people who read it will be like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad somebody said that?
Yeah, I hope it's empowerment because I think so much of us we're in the back seat thinking like, "Oh, this is how it is." And then to realize like, "Oh, making it better, it depends upon me," right? Nobody's going to make my sex life better except for me. And that includes our spouse, right? Like
Mhm.
they're not going to make our sex life better unless we're willing participants and like want to make it better. So it's really that empowerment of like nobody can do this except for you. So why wouldn't you want to see what there could be? And I love the saying like nobody's such an expert at sex that they can't get better at it. Like
Yeah.
there's nobody, right? It's just and it's really just continued personal development of like learning to feel your feelings, learning to communicate your needs, learning boundaries. It's like everything you learn to become somebody who's sexually confident and fulfilled spills over into everything else. It's like the last frontier of personal development.
It's so true. And I mean, I think once we accept, and this is a really hard thing for us to accept because our parents don't like, hammer it home or anything, but like our sexuality is such an integral part of who we are. It's like our intellect, our physicality, our emotional parts of us, like all of those things have to be developed, right? And so when we say, okay, we are sexual beings, and so it's important to dial that in. And, you have these women, especially, and I think you mostly talk to women here, but who, they don't know anything about their bodies. They don't know anything about their sexuality. They've been taught to think that it's bad, that they shouldn't enjoy it. So they get into these marriages where their husbands want sex all the time. And they're like, this is not that great. Like, my favorite saying that you have is like, it's kind of like, I can't make you want melted ice cream, right? Like, they're like, this isn't that great. And so they fall into this like horrible cycle of duty sex. Like, I have to have sex every so often. I don't really like it, but it keeps my husband from being grumpy, or the awful, like it keeps him from having an affair, whatever those crazy thoughts are. But can you just talk about that for a second? Like, how can we shift that paradigm from, sex is just not that great to something it actually can be for me and I can look forward to it. And, I'm not bad for wanting it.
Yeah, totally. And at first, I want to acknowledge how incredibly prevalent this is. That like the scenario you described is it's everywhere USA, probably everywhere the world.
Yeah.
But just to acknowledge, like, if that is you, you're listening, and that's you, you are not alone. You are in the welcome of to the group of millions, right? So first, I want to acknowledge that. The second thing I want to acknowledge is the way you start is just awareness, right? Of like seeing what the current scenario is. And I talk about that a lot in the book of like you can't figure out where you want to go because you've never been there, right? But it's like understanding where you are is a great place to start and to realize like maybe I'm not a sexual being or I don't think I'm a sexual being because what do we call those women who enjoy sex, right?
Hmm.
We call them bad words. So
Yeah.
of course we've been socialized to not be the woman who enjoys sex, right? And then we beat ourselves up for not enjoying sex. So it's a complete, double-edged sword. But then to think like maybe the sex I'm having isn't what good sex is. But I just think that's what all sex is, so I must not like it, right? And it's like you're just eating mushy broccoli for dinner, and people are like, Yeah, I'm over at the 5-star restaurant. Just wanted to let you know there's a 5-star restaurant. Like,
Yeah.
keep eating the mushy broccoli if that's what you want to do, but like have some awareness that other people's it's not that they're loving the mushy broccoli, it's that they've figured out that sometimes there's chicken and sometimes there's pasta and sometimes like there's a very varied menu. But we get into, couples in long-term relationships get into these sexual scripts, right?
Mhm.
We get repetitive, like, like we do, that's just humans, right? Like, on Mondays we have tuna for dinner, whatever. We just get into, like, Tuesday I exercise. But you get into these scripts, and we do that with our sex life. And for a lot of people, boring is not sexy, right? And the other part is, are you having sex for another person? You're having that guy's great, awesome sex, but it's not great, awesome sex for you. And then realizing you're not the broken one, you've just been having somebody else's sex life. You got to figure out your own.
Yeah, so good. So my favorite chapter by far in the book is chapter 9, and it's called Communication is Lubrication. And I think it deals a lot with what you just said, but maybe because I'm all about how good emotional intimacy leads to like every other type of intimacy, like that's kind of my jam. But I love your tips on how to talk to your partner about sex because you get all the good marriage advice when you get married, but nobody says, talk about what sex means to you and what good sex is and what feels good to you. So, what do you think are some of the most important things to remember when you're even just learning how to talk to your partner about sex?
Yeah, that this is a team, right? We're trying to figure out something for the relationship, not just for you, not just for them. So it's a team, and the problem solving can happen as a team. Blaming will shut things down super fast. Like, blame and shame, not good. So it's like more curiosity. Like, what would it look like if this? Or even just sharing what you've learned. Like, hey, listen to this podcast, and did you know that it's like totally normal for there to be two different sex drives in a relationship? Just kind of like peppering with some information. Or like, man, did you know that in heterosexual relationships, the orgasm gap is bigger than in any other relationship? I'm super curious about why women aren't having as many orgasms when they're partnered with a man. Just like being super curious about stuff like that instead of like, you never give me orgasms.
Right.
And like it's always like how not to talk to your partner. And
Yeah.
then realizing like you don't have to solve everything right away. I like the saying of like 31-minute conversations instead of one 30-minute conversation. And
Yeah.
talking about it early when like things might be going well, right? Because if you talk about it then, it's going to be a lot easier to talk about it after you had a baby or after a health scare or when you're really stressed at work or when there's a death in the family. Like all these things that do affect our sex drive and our sexuality.
Yeah. And I like to like pepper in some logistical things too. Like talks about sex probably shouldn't take place in your bedroom. That's like highly charged and that's where it happens. And so maybe like go on a walk, but maybe even set up a schedule. Like we talk about our sex life on Thursdays when we walk, like that's a great,
So good.
it's our sexy walk time, like just always be having that conversation. Like, what went well this last time? Or like, hey, I just had a baby and like, don't touch my boobs. Like, it just don't, like all of those types of things. Or I really liked when you were talking about your fantasy this last time or whatever. There's like so many really fun things that we can have those ongoing, like you said, conversations about because it's not a one and done. So maybe even having a schedule or, when we go on date nights, after the dessert, we talk about sex,
Yeah,
whatever.
I really like the walking thing because there's something to forward movement and like neurobiologically, right? So there's something to forward movement and scanning the horizon that really creates a sense of safety for the brain, and you're not doing direct eye contact. And
Mm,
sometimes that is a much less threatening when you're having a conversation that you want to be like open and listening. And sometimes it's better to be, where are you the best listener, right? Because
mhm.
it's not just about communicating what you need, but how can you also listen in an open and safe space for your partner to share? Because a lot of women are like, he won't talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, that's an invitation to be like, how are you listening? How are you presenting it? Why is he shutting down? Things like that.
And are you freaking out? Like you probably should take a really good inventory of like, how am I responding when he starts telling me about sex? Like, am I freaking like, oh my gosh, he's gonna have an affair? Or, oh my gosh, he's a pervert or whatever, like, how are you responding to these conversations? Are you a safe place to be talking about these things?
Yeah, and if you notice, I agree with that. And if you notice, like a lot of judgment comes up, right? Even in just listening to you and me talk about sex right now, if a lot of judgment comes up, again, that's an awareness tool of like, oh, isn't it curious that I find I'm super judgy about this? Isn't it super curious that I think I'm the expert on like how this should be? Right? It's like just that awareness is the start of that personal growth of like, wow, where did the judgment about sex come from? Isn't that interesting?
Right. So good. It's good to like look back in your history and be like, how did my parents deal with this? Like, what kind of, what are my deficits here? Like, how could I open up myself a little bit to this human, like, what do we call this? Is this a human thing?
Experience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
human experience. That's so important. And I don't want to go 50 years hating this thing that I do, right? Like, oh, that sounds awful, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you talk about in the book, you also talk about desire, brakes and accelerators, medication, menopause. Why do you feel like all of this is so valuable for couples to understand in order to create a great sexual relationship and to understand honestly that they are not broken?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about when we get sex ed, like, let alone if it was decent sex ed, but it's really, junior high, high school, when you don't know how to be an adult, you don't know the life stressors of being adult, certainly haven't had children usually, and you haven't even had any practice of being in a relationship with anybody, right? And so it's almost this like adult sex ed that it's like, get some basics down, understand how it works, understand how our brains work, and understand our bodies change as we get older, and that's okay, right? It's that judgment on our performance and judgment on our bodies of like it needs to be how it was when we were 22. And it's like, well, how's that working out for you? Right? Like first of all, most people don't want to be 22 again. But it's like if you are, body shaming or, let's say the penis doesn't work as well or the vagina is going through some menopause change and you're just like wishing you were 22 again, that's not helping you like understand that you're fighting with reality. And sometimes just a little bit of education into that stuff goes a long way in like accepting where we are and accepting our bodies are changing and like, let's try anyways.
Yeah, totally, totally. So what do you think is the biggest fallacy out there keeping people from really enjoying partnered sex?
Oh man, I mean, I really think it's like for both men and women, it's like that sex is, I'm talking in, a heterosexual relationship, but that sex is putting a penis in a vagina. It's killing sex lives. It's literally, and not only is it killing sex lives, it's just making sex bad for so many people. And now, granted, that sex is great for about half of the population. But when we think that's what sex is, and we realize 70% of women don't have an orgasm that way, and boring sex is devastating for a lot of people, right? Meaning, like, yeah, well, you don't crave our brain. That's how dopamine in our brain works. We don't crave repetition. We don't like, we love the comfort of a monogamous, long term relationship, but our brain doesn't crave the same thing for dinner every single night. And then
Yeah.
you're like, maybe I'm just not sexual. And it's like, well, maybe you're just eating the same thing for dinner for 20 years.
Right. So is your suggestion to add something to the penis and vagina sex? Because if it's working for half the population, like, do we just add what's working for the other half of the population to the
I think that's great. Why not?
yeah.
Yeah. And I would say, if people actually wanted to take my prescription for it, but for me, I'm like, do what works for you, but it's trial and error and you're gonna have to figure it out. But it's like, do the penis and vagina last
Mhm.
for a couple of reasons. Number one, the vulva owner needs good arousal, right? For putting something in the vagina to not hurt in the first place. And I think a lot of people, they just start sex by putting something in the vagina. It causes pain. So then we don't have sex, right? So it's like, take care of her, get her arousal, get her orgasm. Now her pelvis is all the more accepting to put something in the vagina. And then number two is after he has an orgasm, his brain might be like, what's for dinner? Right? So it's like, if that's how it is, and that might not be how it is, but if that's how it is, make sure that's at the very end of the show because otherwise it'll be like, well, yeah, I didn't have an orgasm. That's fine. And then 20 years go by and she's had, half the amount of pleasure that he has. And like, then they think she's the problem. And it's like, no, you guys just stopped.
Yeah.
So it's like put that before, put her pleasure first. And if that doesn't work for you, great, God bless. Go, I'm not going to tell you what to do. But it's like just tips for people if they're like, how does this work? What's the best scenario? How should we start? It's like she has an orgasm, however works best for her. Then he has an orgasm.
So good. So good.
But I mean, even me, like I even like hate telling people like how to like don't listen to me. I don't want you to think about me in bed.
I think it's great. Dr. Kelly said to do it this way.
Right? I know, but if it doesn't work, it doesn't mean you're broken. It just means you're one of like 8 billion people in this world. You got to figure out your own sexual fingerprint.
It's true. And it's so important. It's so important. Like, it's important to figure out how you learn. It's important to figure out how you build muscle. It's important to figure out how you experience pleasure in life. Like, it's just part of learning about yourself.
Totally. Yeah, yeah. And for women to figure out what turns us on, right? Because we spend our whole life not trying to desire sex. Because remember, we call those women bad words. So we turn off, it's accelerators and brakes, but we put on so many brakes of like, sex comes last, right? I got to do the dishes, I got to blah, 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 I got to prep for sex comes last. And it's like what you prioritize is what grows in your relationship. And so just realize where you're prioritizing sex and why are you prioritizing? Do you think that your pleasure isn't important? That's good to know. That's good awareness, right? Do you think that you could become a person whose pleasure is important? What would that look like?
Yeah.
You know, so like there's so much personal growth in just thinking about sex.
So true. And can you imagine? I mean, yeah, maybe, younger, you get those bad names, but can you imagine how your husband's going to describe you to his buddies when you like are totally, you just love having sex? Like your husband's like, dude, I lucked out. My wife is like a freaking animal. I love it.
Yeah, 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 totally. But again, we're not good. We're not doing this for our partners, my friends.
That's true. That is true. That is true. But I do like
We're
it.
doing it for ourselves.
I do like it when my husband's like, I am so freaking lucky. I'm like, hell yeah, you are.
That's awesome.
Okay, so my question that I ask everybody all the time, it's like how I distill down the secrets of happily ever after. But if you had the undivided attention of all the couples in all the world for just a few minutes, what's the most important thing you would want to teach them about how to enjoy sex more?
Equality matters. Equality matters in pleasure, and if it's a biased relationship in that way, right? If somebody's taking or getting more than the other person is, over the long run, that might not be best for if you want to stay sexual. And then the second thing I would say is prioritize it, right? We get all our panties in a bunch over like, we shouldn't have to schedule it. It's like you've scheduled sex your whole life. Now you just think it should be spontaneous now. I don't know why. But like when you were dating, Friday night was your date night, you were kind of scheduling sex, right? And so like just to be like prioritize it. It's the same as exercise and eating right. It's like if you don't prioritize healthy meals, you're going to eat crap. If you don't prioritize exercising, you're not going to be somebody who has fitness in their life. It's like if you're in a relationship that started out as a sexual relationship and you want to continue it to be a sexual relationship, you must prioritize it. And we're all entitled to think like I should be fit and like have a high fiber diet without prioritizing those things. It's like, no, you just got to prioritize what you want in your life.
Oh, it's so hard though. It's so hard. We all know what we're supposed to be doing. It's just really hard to actually do it.
Yeah, well, that's where coaching comes in, right? Why do you think your sex life is hard?
That's right.
Again, awareness. Like, why do you think a sex life is hard? There's a lot to learn in answering that question for yourself. And whether it's I don't have the time, which again, you and I talked about time scarcity, right? Easy to fix. Time scarcity is a great thing to be coached on. Whether you think you don't know what turns you on, great. That's something to learn, right? So even analyzing sex is hard will teach you a hell of a lot about your sex life.
So good. So good. Okay, so do you think understanding all of these things and really working on having a healthy and thriving sex life is good for your children's healthy development?
Yeah, I do because they're gonna see, if they're living in a house with two people who are sexually active, you're gonna see them. The kids are gonna see them communicate well. They're gonna see that they prioritize their relationship. They go out on dates, right? The kids are actually gonna see healthy behaviors modeled. Whether you're probably not being very explicit with them of like, look at us have a great sex life, but it's like the things that you're showing and portraying of like tomorrow I'm going on a date with my husband. My kids know that they're getting a babysitter because I'm going on a date with my husband. Like they're seeing that. And it's like I want to prioritize time alone with him because that's important to our relationship. So yeah, I think, it's not that you're saying, kids, we have a great sex life, but it's like you're saying like this is what two people who love each other and care about each other and like want to actively work on that. Well, that's what it looks like.
So good. And eventually when they get married, you'll have a lot to share.
Totally.
I love it so much. This has been so much fun, Dr. Kelly. I like don't want to keep you too long. I know you are so busy. But tell my listeners where they can find you, learn more about your work, and pick up a copy of You Are Not Broken.
Totally. Well, I'm most active on Instagram. So for anybody on Instagram, Kelly Casperson MD is where I do a lot of my reels and lives and stuff like that. My podcast is You're Not Broken. That's on any major platform. And then Amazon has the paperback and the ebook. The audiobook I just recorded, so it's going to be me, my voice, so it'll be fun. So that'll probably be in the next couple of months.
Very
And that's
cool.
all on Amazon.
Very cool. Well, thank you again so much for your time. And let's just keep educating the world that it is possible to really enjoy sex.
It is. It's just personal growth, my friends. You can do it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you again.
To learn more ways to deepen your intimacy and strengthen your relationship, make sure you watch this video next on 3 ways to supercharge emotional intimacy, which is the workhorse to all the other types of intimacy.